and then carbs always get stuck at like a 5% level, just generically. And I don't think that's true. I think more complex carbs, you have that range of fibrous carbs to starch to sugar, and you're gonna see that some of those complex carbs are higher in thermic potential. And as long as you don't have that fat present, they're just going to be used more efficiently. So let's get into how your body deals with excess fat, because I think this will help you guys understand why lower fat, higher carb diets are more efficient. When you consume fat, as I said, if you have an energy need, remember your body prefers glucose. We need carbohydrates broken down into glucose for energy as a primary source for all the cells in your body. When that's not present, we can use fat, but most of the time not directly. Your body's still going to go through a process of converting that fat into glucose. We use the phrase in a previous video, gluconeogenesis, creating new glucose from something else. And it can be amino acids, can be fat. But that's a very inefficient process, so your body just stores fat easier and then will only use what it needs gradually. Do you remember me ever telling that story when I was in college of a professor who did a blood draw for fat? Okay. It was a pretty cool thing. It was weird. I don't think you could do that today. Like, you had a nurse come in and somebody had to sign a waiver and somebody drew blood, but somebody volunteered. It wasn't me. And they drew blood and they put it in a test tube, and so you just had kind of the base sample. Then they had that person eat a cheeseburger and fries. 15 minutes later, they drew blood. They put it next to the other test tube, and within minutes, you could see just oil separating from the blood, the hemoglobin, plasma. And so within a few minutes, the top half of the test tube just looked like olive oil, and the bottom half was blood. It had totally separated.
Wow.
So when you consume fat, you're dealing with just what you see on your kitchen counter. It's just fat. It's an oil. Saturated fat, of course, is solid at room temperature. It has the trans fats. We talked about that in a previous episode, and that's what can really create atherosclerosis a lot more easily. It attracts things to it that sticks to your artery walls. But even a healthy fat, and burger fries are not healthy fat necessarily, but you see that oil is a constituent that your body is just going to draw across the adipose membranes and store as fat. It takes very little energy to do that, way less energy, and that's the evolutionary process of efficiency. Your body's always going to use the least amount of energy to accomplish its goals. So that's why carbs are always the preferred source of energy.
So with that said, why don't you just slash all your carbs? Like the keto, not necessarily keto, but just slash your carbs. What would happen there if you did that dramatically?
Well, the good thing is that is, in this section, a part of fasting or starvation. So let's say that all of a sudden you have no energy stores or sources at all, just nothing, and you go into that extreme fasting. If you were, to your point, getting at least some fat, like a ketogenic diet, you do become keto adapted, and your body even becomes more efficient at using fat as energy. More efficient, still not the best efficiency. So they have even done studies showing that athletes, because I make this claim all the time. If you're such a proponent of ketogenic, low-carb dieting, well, why don't you have every NBA player do that? If your client was an Olympic sprinter going for the gold medal, would you want that person on a ketogenic diet?
No, never.
Intuitively, because we live in bodies the same, we know you cannot function at your best without carbs. Right. But here's the interesting thing. If you're totally keto adapted, you can become up to, studies have shown, 40% better at using fat as energy than a normal person.
But nobody can stay there.
Well,
you can really get to that point.
Well, you can theoretically.
Yeah.
But does anybody?
No.
And even if you did, that is a marker of starvation. And so what you're doing is your body is becoming more efficient at using fat as energy to survive. At the same time, you're slowing your metabolism so that you're using that fat more sparingly.
Okay.
So a ketogenic diet is setting you up for starvation.
Now, if you do it, the longer you do it, the worse it is for your metabolic rate.
Well, here's the interesting thing. That's a great point, because when you reduce your metabolism, remember, metabolism is the sum of all chemical energy in a cell. All of that is slowing down, right? Which includes the slowing down of aging.
Okay.
So if you're really interested in living the longest, you actually do want to starve yourself a little bit, you know?
You might die before you actually
Before you extend your life. But no, they've done studies. This especially works well in rat studies. Rats were the first mammal evolutionarily to give rise to other mammals, including primates and us. And that's why, we still share, I think, over 97%, maybe 96% of our DNA. It's identical with rats. So that's why rat studies work so well in research.
Okay.
We have like 99.4% similarity with chimpanzees, but still at 96, 97% with rats. That you wouldn't think so much in common with rats.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But yeah, their organ systems, everything is identical to ours. So to Tyler's point, if you do want to be in a ketogenic, keto-adapted state for whatever reason, there are some benefits to longevity, although I think those are being contended now, saying it's still, you may extend your life, but it's what kind of life is it when it's lower quality, because you are getting some of those symptoms of starvation.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Exactly. But for you guys, the key point to that is when you overconsume fat, the reason the thermic potential is only 3% or less is because even if your calorie base for that meal is pretty moderate, most of that fat is instantly stored as body fat because you have other things there. You're still going to have some protein. Whether or not you have carbs, there's enough energy there that a dominant portion of that fat is stored instantly as fat. Where, like I said a few minutes ago, carbs are inefficiently converted to fat. It takes more energy, so your body would rather not do that. It would rather hang on to them in the form of glycogen and use that as more of an intermediate energy source later. So what about protein? What if we overconsume protein like Tyler did as a kid? If you don't throw it up, what would you know would happen?
Throw it up. You can still store body fat as well. It kind of converts in the same way. It converts to glucose and gets stored if it's in excess.
Absolutely. So you can as protein is broken down into amino acids, we can use those amino acids for all the functions we talked about a couple episodes ago, and that is for all the structural elements, chemical catalysts, all that. But you can also turn those amino acids, like Tyler just said, into glucose to be used as energy. So excess protein can even take you out of ketosis. So most people don't realize a high protein, high fat diet is not a ketogenic diet.
Is it the glutamine that's in the protein that kind of takes you out more? You want to try and eliminate glutamine as much as possible?
Probably initially.
Okay.
60 or so % of muscle tissue is glutamine because it's a gluconergic amino acid, meaning your body will use that in the place of glucose. It'll use that first. So that's kind of a buffer against muscle loss. So if you're consuming amino acids in the form of like a chicken breast, that would also have high amount of glutamine in there. And you're right, you would be able to use that initially first as glucose. But other amino acids, the other 21 aminos, can also be just converted through Krebs cycle mechanisms into energy, into glucose. And if you don't need it, let's say you're having 100 grams of protein in a meal, you will just store that as fat. It can also be converted to fat.
Now, do you ever hear claims of people saying that you can eat as much protein as you want and don't worry about gaining body fat? I hear that a lot, where they'll already be tracking their macros and hit numbers, and just social media, hoopla, where they're like, oh yeah, just keep eating more protein. You won't store any body fat. Just keep eating more.
It's the reason I'm laughing is there's always a biochemical answer. So I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna say no, that's not possible. You can always convert protein.
It's got to go somewhere.
Right.
Like, you just logically, it's never just going to be like poof.
Right.
It's gone.
But it's also a very self-regulating thing, because you end up like you said, you got to throw up right before you can store his fats.
Yeah.
That's what I keep laughing. I'm just picturing like 7-year-old Tyler throwing up a box of. But there is kind of a self-regulating thing, and that's why I think so many people are attracted to ketogenic diets in the first place. I mean, seriously, how many chicken breasts are you going to eat before you're like, I would just rather not eat?
Yeah, it's just too many.
There is a point of satiety where some people feel like, okay, more protein fills me up volumetrically, and so that makes me feel better. But I would challenge anybody who's ever been on a low carb diet to say, okay, I could just eat 2 or 3 chicken breasts and still feel pretty hungry from a depletion standpoint. You can still feel weak and shaky. Your blood sugar can still be low. And that's what a lot of people run into when they think, well, I'll just eat more protein instead of carbs. People try and suppress their carbs so much that they just consider that the enemy. Mm-hmm. And then they eat more and more protein, but they still never feel satisfied, sated, and so they end up still binging at some point on carbs.
Yep. And you see a lot of people try and shoot to stay ahead of hunger all the time because they're always thinking about hunger. And so they'll just start pounding a lot more protein to think that'll help, but really it's just causing kind of more problems. They're just making themselves hungrier.
I think so.
Getting rid of carbs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people end up in that space where they're just, it's almost kind of a sad thing. You guys are going to deal with this with clients all the time, where they're really claiming these things that they feel like they know from, like you said, social media, something like that, and I just need more protein, carbs are bad. And you can see them just kind of sliding down into a spiral of worsening behaviors because they try harder and harder to keep carbs out of their diet. And then, maybe they're eating more protein or not, but they still end up on these binge cycles.
Now, what do you do when you binge, when you do have the cycle, and they try and make up for it and way under eat?
Yeah, that is a great point. And I'll probably answer a little bit more completely in an upcoming video.
Okay.
But one of the things that you guys have to realize is, binge eating disorder and just eating disorders in general are a huge issue, and you're going to deal with this. A lot of clients are going to try and hide things like that if they slip, so to speak. They overeat. They maybe have a truly episodic binge behavior pattern. And they're just not going to want to tell you a lot of times. And you have to understand that even if they're reporting those higher levels of food, or I should say normal levels of food, but they're just not losing, anything that you're seeing that just doesn't match up in the reporting, and you've worked through their food logs, you've looked at food sources, you've looked at everything, you almost need to confront them in a good way. I mean, tactful way. You have to say, look, I'm seeing some things here that don't make sense. In the past, it's certainly not uncommon for clients to struggle like this, and binging there's no shame in that. I mean, it happens. We're biological organisms, and you have to help them understand that there's not only some support that you could give them, but you have to refer those people out. That's an important part. I hate to kind of segue into something that dark, but people who I just knew they had some problems with eating, some disordered behaviors that maybe they didn't even recognize as a problem. Every time I've referred them to talk to somebody, and they uncovered a lot of stuff.
They realized everything that was underneath.
Yeah, so Dr. Probst, our health psychologist, she always says eating disorders have nothing to do with food. There's always something else there.
Absolutely.
I do think, though, bad eating can lead to bad behavior.
Absolutely.
Doesn't necessarily become an eating disorder, but that's what we have to guard against. We are the health professionals looking at their food, and then you've got to be ready to refer out. But we're going to extend into the next chapter. Chapter 8 talks about some of these things that we can address this a little bit more. But for this week, guys, just as I said,